Okay, I think we have a good amount of people online now, so let's begin. So thank you so much for joining us. My name is Ilona Brannan. I'm a consultant here at Fuse. You might not be familiar with Fuse Universal, but Fuse is an integrated learning platform, and we work with customers including Vodafone, Scandic Hotels, Hilti and Carpetright, helping them to create measurable business results by delivering learning, skills development and performance coaching to their employees and partners through our consumer-grade technology. In our work with customers, we take the Kirkpatrick model and invert it, and we encourage learning leaders to develop clear success metrics as a starting point for all learning interventions. My work here does a lot of that, and I love what I do, and I love working here with Fuse and getting to share lots of L&D tips and information. And today I'm delighted to welcome Paul Matthews, founder of People Alchemy and author of multiple books, including Learning Transfer at Work, which is the topic of today's subject for this webinar today. Now, questions will be saved for the end, but please feel free during the presentation to put your questions into the chat. Again, make sure that you're putting your questions to all panelists and attendees, and we'll collect them, and then we will share them at the end in a Q&A session. But without further ado, I am so excited to hear from Paul Matthews today, our speaker. Paul?
Hi, how's everybody? I'm here to talk about elephants. So that's why they've got the big picture of an elephant there, which is really interesting. And there's 3 more elephants. This metaphor came out of when I started writing my 3rd book on L&D and the learning transfer one that had just been talked about. And I called it the elephant in the room, the elephant that people are ignoring. I was most amused also to hear, by the way, there's a similar expression in Brazil, and they say there it's the goat under the table. So that's a little bit different. And I started then thinking about the other books I'd written and realized those were also elephants in the room. So I've been writing about elephants for years and never knew it. So that's why we've got 3 elephants there. So what we're going to do is focus a little bit this time on some of the things about learning transfer and also how that impacts at a strategic level. So we're going to look at some really practical tools and ideas and also see how they play out at a higher, more strategic level. So it's going to be interesting having that mix. This is Mike. We'll come back to Mike. We've got a story about Mike, so he's going to help us a little later on. But to start with, we'll look at a particular tool. And for many of us in L&D, this is kind of where it starts, is somebody out there in operations land has a problem. Things aren't going as well as they would like. And they say, okay, we've got this poor performance. What are we going to do about it? And what they typically come and ask for, what they want, is training. It's very common. When I ask this at conferences, all the hands going up say, yes, the managers come and ask for training when they're not getting the performance they want. There's an automatic assumption that if people aren't doing their job properly, they're in some way defective or faulty or missing something, and therefore they need training. Unfortunately, that's actually a big myth, usually in most cases, because for them to come and ask for that, this is the equation that must be going on in their mind. So if you just read that one through, just think about it. There's not a single one of those equal signs really is totally true all of the time. And yet that must be what's happening in that manager's mind in order for them to ask for training to solve their performance problem. The only way that will ever work, by the way, and it is possible to make it work, is if you sprinkle pixie dust on it. And I don't have any pixie dust left. I don't know whether you do. I've asked that many times. I'm still looking for a pixie dust dealer, but I can't find one. I've been told that's what pixie dust looks like, or fairy dust, if you want to call it that. But I don't know. I don't even know if that's really pixie dust or just a fake. I suspect it's a fake, given how little of it there is around. And you see, because we don't have those sackfuls of pixie dust to sprinkle on people that come to the training room, there's a lot that you've got to do both before they come to the training room and after they come to the training room in order for them to end up operationalizing what you've done with them in the training room or on an e-learning course on an LMS or whatever. So it's a formal intervention, usually training, but it could also be online. And really, if we don't do this other stuff that's wrapped around that formal intervention, then we're actually wasting a huge amount of money. It's just falling out. And so what we're going to do is have a look at a few ways that you can help save yourself some money, which is usually a thing that most people quite like to do, especially with the pressure that's on budgets at the moment. So if you think about a performance system, so you've got some inputs and some outputs, and there's some people and procedures and processes and gears and machinery in the middle of that box that is the system. And if you're not getting the outputs you want, clearly there's either something wrong inside the box or the inputs are not right. So the first place to start looking is inside the box. But the trouble is we sort of look at this as a closed system very often. It's an interesting thing that performance is actually, and linguistically, it's a nominalization. It's a verb that's been turned into a noun. And as soon as you turn a verb into a noun, it sort of looks static and fixed. It's something that then is more difficult to do something with. There's a lot of those nominalizations that cause problems. And another one is communication, another one's relationship. If you think about it, so it's about people performing or communicating. And they can change, and that can get better or worse, and it ebbs and flows. And that's why it makes it more easy to think about that as a verb than as a noun. But anyway, let's leave it for a verb at the moment. That's kind of how people focus on it. But what they do is they kind of look at that box as a black box without looking inside it. And so that's what we're going to do now, is I'll give you a simple tool to start looking inside that box to say, well, if you're not getting the performance you want, how can we look at it differently to understand where the levers are so that we can go and pull those levers and change that performance. And this is really relevant because what we need to do is find out, if we're not getting the outputs we want, whether injecting training or any kind of formal learning intervention into that system is going to make a difference. Because if it isn't, there's no point in doing it and then using learning transfer. So this is one of the first steps, is I guess it's a relevancy test in a way. So let's start looking at this system. So if we want performance out the top, clearly we need people to be capable at the point of work of doing what they need to do. And there's actually two factors that lead into them being capable at the point of work. And this is where we're going to have Mike help us out here. So let's come back to Mike. So I'll tell you a story about Mike. He's a mechanic, as you can see, very, very capable mechanic. He looks great in his blue overalls there. But just imagine for a moment that you are taking a 7-year-old boy to football practice, whether it's English football or American football or whatever. It's the sport that he loves. He really wants to go. You've ended up with taxi duty, so you're taking little Johnny to his sports practice, and you come out of your driveway and you can hear a strange noise somewhere near the engine of your car. And you're a bit worried about that because you've not heard that engine, that noise there in the engine before. So you just drive it around the corner to your local workshop, your garage, the place that you always take it. They know you, you've been there for years. And this is Mike having a listen to your car to find out what that noise might be. And he says, that's okay. It happens sometimes with this model. There's a little plastic piece. It's cracked. It's rattling. That's what we can hear. I'll just get a new one out of the spare parts department and you'll be on your way, all fixed in a few minutes. And you turn to little Johnny and say, it's okay, we've got some time to spare. Mike will fix the car and then we'll be on to football practice. However, Mike comes back a couple of minutes later and says, I'm really sorry, but we don't have that spare part in stock. So I can't fix your car right now. Now, we normally have it in stock. It's our fault. I'm really sorry. You're a regular customer. We'll get it couriered in and I'll come to your place first thing tomorrow morning and I'll fix it on your driveway completely for free, our service to you. But I would take your car straight home right now, because if you keep driving it and the rest of that plastic piece breaks off, there's a good chance you could do some serious engine damage. So just take it straight back home right now. Johnny's looking a little upset at this point. He's worrying about missing football practice. So you're driving round the corner straight back home. And my question to you is, was that mechanic capable of fixing your car? Yes or no? So just notice what your answer to that question is. And some of you might be thinking, yes, he was capable. And some of you might be thinking, well, no, he wasn't. But what if I was to ask little Johnny, when he stops crying, was he worried about missing football practice? So, okay, Johnny, we'll get a taxi. We can sort this out. Not a problem. We'll grab a taxi and we'll go to football practice together. But Johnny, was Mike capable of fixing our car? And little Johnny's always going to say no, because you've got a broken car still. What's really interesting here is that a lot of people, I think, when I ask that question, are actually answering a slightly different question. They're answering the question, was Mike competent to fix the car? And the answer is yes, he's absolutely competent. You can tell he's a competent mechanic by that picture. Absolutely. But in the moment, actually, he was not capable of fixing the car because he didn't have a spare part. Now, we don't know why he didn't have a spare part. There might be all sorts of reasons. But effectively, what we do know is in the moment, when asked to do his job, he was incapable. And it wasn't that he had a competency problem. So sending him off to a training course wouldn't have helped. But what he did have was an environment problem. Something around him was limiting his ability to do the job. So just for the purposes for the moment, let's define capability as, can the worker do the job in front of them, yes or no? And you'll find that people use those words competence and capability quite interchangeably often, and sometimes meaning different things. So when you're talking as an L&D professional with the business, get real clarity about that word or any similar sort of ideas as to what people mean by that. So we can have Mike as a competent mechanic, but you can put him into a situation where he is rendered incapable by his surroundings. Here's a picture that'll help to remind you of that. There's Dennis. He's a very competent donkey. I believe Mike and Dennis know each other. They're both very competent. But right now, Dennis is incapable of pulling the cart. He can't. His feet are off the ground. And the reason he can't pull the cart is pretty clearly he's got a really bad manager who doesn't understand how to load the cart up properly. So there is a competent donkey rendered incapable by bad managers. And when I say that, a lot of people say, oh yeah, no, we've got that. That happens at our company. Management is one of our problems. So what's really interesting is if we go back to our original diagram where we've got performance and then capability at the point of work, we're talking about the performer, the person who's doing the performing. Remember, we're talking about a verb here, not a noun. And those are the components that you might consider as being what make up competence. And someone's ready to do the job. Knowledge and facts, skills and expertise are things that you need to practice a little bit. And then the insight and understanding on how to use that knowledge and those skills. The mental state is sort of, how do I feel at the moment? Do I want to do it? Am I motivated to do it? And the physical state is really, am I physically capable of doing it? So some jobs do require a certain level of physical stamina or skill or height or dexterity or whatever in order to do it. So those are all the components of competence. And then we look at the other side of this page, and that's the environment, the stage on which that performer is performing. And you've got all these other things that are related to it, including, in Mike's case, the missing spare part. So these are all the factors that make up and are, in effect, competence of the environment. It's interesting that we do these competency frameworks for people, and yet we very seldom do a competency framework for the environment. Perhaps we should be. Now, some organizations do get into that kind of thing, but usually at quite a high level. They don't normally do it focused at the individual worker level to see how they're being supported by the environment or hindered by their environment. And that's really quite interesting. So we end up with this overall diagram of these two factors that lead into someone being capable at the point of work in order to deliver on what's necessary to deliver the performance and therefore the results that are required. One of this actually comes out of my second book on capability, but a nice tool to dig into this is the cause-effect diagram, sometimes called the fishbone diagram or the Ishikawa diagram. So that's a way you can start looking at this and drilling down into it. So I'm not going to go into that in detail here. We don't really have the time. But what I'm trying to point out is that if you think about it, most of the time when someone is not capable at the point of work and is therefore deemed to be not performing in the moment, most of the time the problem is on the right-hand side of that page, not the left-hand side. But all too often what happens is someone says, we're not getting the performance we want, therefore they're not capable, therefore they must be missing skills and knowledge, so therefore we'll train them. And all they're doing is dealing with those top two bullets on the left-hand side, when there's a very good chance the root cause of the lack of performance comes from somewhere else anyway. So the training is never going to work. And certainly trying to transfer it is pointless because it's still not going to help anything. If you just think back over the last, few weeks of what you've been doing and think about the things that you were able to achieve and the things that you were unable to achieve. In other words, tasks you delegated to yourself or someone delegated to you and you were unable to do them on time or to the quality you wanted. In other words, your performance was less than perhaps ideal. And then think about how many of those times you performed poorly on a task over the last month was a result of you not knowing what to do, and how many of those times it was because of something outside of you that was limiting your ability to do that task effectively. Most people I talk to say a good 70, 80, 90% of the time, I know what to do, I want to do it, I'm okay. It's just that the train was late, the IT broke down, my laptop didn't work, a colleague didn't deliver their stuff on time. Something happened that actually stopped you, whether it was in your control or not. So what we find is that the vast majority of performance issues often arise in the environment around someone. So really what we've got to do here is get this idea that just because someone's asking for training doesn't mean that we should automatically give them training. It's this difference between want and need. I want an ice cream, but actually I might need an apple. That's one that I love ice cream, but anyway. So just because that manager wants training, you need to go through a process to help filter those requests to understand which ones will actually result in an operational performance improvement and which ones, because the root cause has nothing to do with knowledge or skills, where the training probably won't have much effect. And that process I've just kind of given you is one that you can take through that manager when they come asking for training. And effectively, you've got a situation like this where you're putting a shield or a filter up around learning and development to protect that L&D budget you've got. And a lot of the requests that come in will bounce off that filter because they really should never get into L&D at all. And I've seen this happen in organizations where and now we're going to go up to a strategic level, if you start thinking at a strategy level that we will have this performance consultancy discussion with anybody that comes to us with a training request, and that's a strategic imperative within the way that you're going to manage your L&D strategy, then you will save yourself a lot of money because a lot of the requests for training won't get actioned inside L&D. They'll end up bouncing back into the business because the real problem is out there in operations land, and it's not one that you can fix with a learning solution. Or certainly learning, even if it is part of that solution, could well be a very small part. So this is about that filter around L&D. But for that little white arrow, the ones that do get through into your L&D department, where you then start saying, right, now we've got to do something about that learning request because we know it's real and we know it can have an impact at a business level. Then you can start doing something with it. And what I've done there is separate that process into two pieces. So again, this is a strategic approach. It's like, first, let's do performance consultancy. And then when that process of performance consultancy has proved that we need some training or some e-learning or whatever it is as a formal intervention, then we will start doing learning consultancy. Okay, there's a fundamental difference there. And performance consultancy starts from the premise that we're not really sure what's going wrong, but something's going wrong. So we're going to go and investigate and find out where the problem is, where the barriers to performance are, where the causes are. And so this is performance consultancy. At some point in time, if that proves that we need some learning, then we'll start doing learning consultancy. And learning consultancy starts from the premise that I know there's going to be a learning solution. I don't know what it is yet, and I don't know how it's going to get delivered. but we know that we're going to get learning involved at some point. And it might be a job aid, it might be classroom, it might be e-learning, it might be coaching or anything else. Who knows what it might be? But that's the learning consultancy piece. And what I see a lot of L&D people doing is leaping into doing learning consultancy too early, before they have actually proven the case that a learning intervention is even going to be useful for the presenting problem. So, okay, that's again, that strategy thing. And the reason I'm saying that this is relevant to learning transfer is there's no point in adding learning transfer stuff to a training program where the training program itself is not going to help the business. So that relevancy is a critical part, if you like, of learning transfer, because it stops you doing a lot of stuff that's unnecessary. And then the next thing, of course, is if you are going to then invest some budget into the formal training and learning, then you need to be thinking about learning transfer. Many will have heard Robert Brinkerhoff's research. He was a professor at West Michigan University, and he developed a success case method for evaluating learning impact and so on, which is a very good tool. I really rate it highly as a tool. But his research in general came up with a rough figure of 1 in 6 or thereabouts of people will implement what you give them in a training course, assuming you just put them in a room and do a fairly traditional training approach. And there's lots of other figures from other research. And what's interesting is learning transfer research goes back over 110 years, would you believe? The first academic papers are that old. So this is not new. The academic world has been doing work on this for ages, and that's perhaps one of the problems, is there's so much research on it, it's actually difficult to separate the wheat from the chaff. But I'm going to get to something shortly which will help you do that. So when we think about learning transfer, this is a cartoon I saw, and I can't remember where I found that now, so I do apologize for attribution. But there's this whole idea of there is a training course and then something happens. So we're back to that pixie dust stuff again, if you think about it. There's magic and then performance improved. So what is that magic? And it has to be learning transfer. It has to be taking what you've learned in a classroom, embedding it and sustaining it and operationalizing it out there in the workflow. And of course, that means you're going to have to do some things out there in the workflow, because without the pixie dust, without this stuff, no one is going to leave that classroom fully operational. That just doesn't happen. That's not how classrooms work. So despite the fact the manager might wish you to be able to do that, that's not kind of how it's going to work. And so you do have to spend some time often with the managers saying, this is, you know, we can do a certain amount, but ultimately a lot of this has to come back to you. So as a learning and development professional, don't let the manager make you responsible for the operational capability of their people. And I use the word capability there because so much of what leads into capability, as you saw in that earlier diagram, are the things in the environment. And a lot of those are, of course, under the control of the local manager. Not all of them, but a lot of them are, certainly. So here's the good news. There are levers inside that system, and there are transfer levers. This, I won't go through all of these in detail. There's a website down there on the bottom right, and the slides will be available, so you can go and have a look. But I've done some work with Dr. Ina Weinbauer-Heidel, who's she did a PhD in learning transfer. She's based in Austria, and in fact, she's over here in the UK in a couple of weeks, and I'm speaking with her at the World of Learning conference. So it'd be good to see her again. But she did her PhD, and she went through all of this research, which is why I know it goes back over 110 years, because she told me. And she came up with a massive list of determinants of learning transfer, and then started whittling that down and joining some together that was similar and so on. So she came down and ended up with this model where there's actually 12 different levers, as she calls them, for learning transfer. And she's written a book on it with those 12 levers in it. I would highly recommend you get a copy. It's really practical stuff. And basically for success at learning transfer, you need to go through and do something with all of those different levers. Now, we're not got time today to go through all of them, but we're going to touch on a couple more. But one of the ones I have been talking about up to now is number 5, content relevance. Because if the content's not relevant, people won't transfer it. And that's why you need to do that diagnostic stuff up front correctly, so that when you do deliver formal training to people or e-learning, it's relevant to them. Because if it's not relevant, they're just going to say, well, I don't care. See, adults are quite goal-orientated as learners. So unless they can see that what you're asking them to learn will have a direct impact on one of the things they're trying to achieve, they actually, I got other things to do. I can't be bothered with that. But you'll notice the first 3 there about the trainees are very much about the mindset of the trainee. And then there's stuff about design, and then stuff about organization. And number 12 is in some ways the big one, because that's the culture of the organization, what is being expected. So I'm going to come back to a couple of these. So what I'm going to do is just come back to our performance diagram again and have another look at that, and thinking, well, if we've done our diagnostics process and we've proven that some input of training would be useful, or some other formal intervention, how are we going to make sure that when we input training into that system, it has an impact over the long haul? Because that's what we want, is something to be embedded and sustained. So there's a few things that I'm going to touch on here that will give you a practical way to look at this. And of course, when you think about that from a strategic perspective, what we're really saying is, at a strategy level, if we put people in a classroom, we will do what it takes to embed and sustain and transfer that learning. That should be a statement of that ilk in your strategy document at a high level. So then you can start thinking, you don't do just a one-day training. We now have maybe a 4 or 5 day program spread over 6 months. 1 day of that happens to be in the classroom. So you need to be starting to think about programs, not events, and thinking about performance as the output rather than learning. So just those 2 shifts themselves need to be really obvious and explicitly stated in your learning strategy. So go back to your learning strategy and look at that. What I sometimes do with people, I say, let's give it the elephant test. Because I get a lot of people send me their learning strategies. Can you comment on this or that? So it's fascinating seeing all the different ones. But take your learning strategy with a highlighter pen and go through it, and just highlight any sections that apply to any of those 3 elephants. And the 3 elephants are, one is the performance consultancy stuff I've been talking about. Do you do a full performance consultancy process before you get into something that you would term learning consultancy? If not, that should be in the learning strategy. Do you pay any attention to informal learning? And this is the 70-20-10 stuff and so on. An interesting model. I kind of love it and I hate it for different reasons, but we won't go into that here. But you need to be paying attention to all of the learning that's happening outside of the formal channels, because that's actually where most of it is happening. And also, unless you get your head around informal learning, you'll really struggle to do learning transfer well, because most learning transfer happens informally after a training course. And then the third elephant is the learning transfer. So go through performance consultancy, informal learning, learning transfer, highlight any sentences that relate to those 3. And oh, by the way, there's a 4th sneaky elephant, and that's the brand of L&D. Because if you don't get those first 3 elephants herded up and dealt with, you will find that the brand of L&D, the reputation of L&D, will suffer. And then if your brand is not good as a provider within the organization, you'll have it really difficult to be effective. So again, so you need to be having, I would suggest, some line items in your learning strategy about how you are maintaining, promoting, improving the brand of L&D within the organization. So that's just a little challenge for you with your learning strategy. You do have a learning strategy document, don't you? I hope you do. Anyway, so let's just come back from there, and we'll talk about, here's a typical set of delegates going home from your classroom. There's always one clown, isn't there? But never mind. So we're just sticking with the African theme here. And the next thing they're going to have to do, given what they learned in the classroom, is start experimenting and practicing and getting supported doing that in the workflow in their real job. Because if they don't do that, it's never going to transfer, is it? It isn't going to happen. So what you've got to do is give them opportunities to experiment. So let's say they did something really interesting in their training, or I don't know, bottle feeding a tiger cub. So you've got to have tiger cubs available and some spare ones in the background. So you're never going to learn that in the classroom, really. You'll learn some of the things, how the temperature of the milk, all sorts, but until you have a bottle in one hand and a tiger cub in the other, that'd be kind of fun, wouldn't it? I'd enjoy doing that. That'd be really interesting. But that's where you're going to really learn it, is doing it. And yet so often we push people out of a classroom and then we do nothing. We sort of somehow assume there's pixie dust present, but trust me, there isn't. Anyway, so this is this experimentation and practice. And then what you've got to do as part of the learning transfer is encourage reflection. And I'll give you a little model on reflection. It's one I developed a while back. I call it the learning stack. I'll be talking about this. The basic premise behind this is that there's no learning that happens without some level of reflection somewhere. And I was asked to do some studies and research on this years ago by the British Law Society, and I wrote some articles for them on it, and came up with this model. And I basically say that we need some levels of reflection. And my question to myself was, well, if we can manipulate or manage the quality and quantity of reflection, can we, as a result, manage to some extent the quality and quantity of learning? And I think the answer is yes. So I'll just give you a quick rundown of these different levels here. So at the bottom level, level one, I call it unconscious reflection, which sounds a bit odd. But if you think about it, that's the practice makes perfect stuff. If you keep doing something regularly, even if you're not really thinking about what you're doing, you tend to get better at it. Because unconsciously there's a targeting mechanism in your mind which enables you to move towards a desired outcome. And that's the practice makes perfect thing. At the next level up, you've got that sort of conscious reflection where you are just thinking, well, what happened, what went on? So it's where you're questioning yourself. Who does that better? So it's with questions. The third level up is where you externalize it. And that might be to a journal or a diary. It might be to a colleague at the next desk, or just to the dog when you're taking the dog for a walk. And the reason that's another level of reflection is in order to externalize it, you have to bring in all your language centers in your brain, which you typically aren't usually doing that much when it's all internal reflection with your own sort of internal, I don't know, baby talk or whatever. So that externalization into understandable language that someone else could understand, or you can understand later when you read it later. The fourth level is, again, it's externalized, but this time we are thinking about, well, somebody might judge me based on what I put out there. So I'm going to think twice before I say that to my boss or my coach, or think twice before I, put that report in and submit it and so on. So there's this sense of awareness of judgment, which means I will look over it more than once to just check. And then at the fifth level, you've probably heard the old adage, the best way to learn something is to teach it. I don't think that's totally true. I think actually the juice comes when you prepare the lesson plan to teach it. So there is the 5 levels, and that top one is preparing the lesson plan. So it's also really good, when people come back from a training course, is to just say, well, prepare a little short presentation of what you learned for the rest of the team that didn't go on the course with you. This is useful as a way to look at any of your learning interventions. In fact, is just think about, well, if I'm going to do this particular learning intervention, how far up the stack is it going to push them? Because the further up that stack you can push them, the more that stuff will be memorized, the more it'll generalize, the more it'll link to other things they've already got, and the more it'll stick. So it's a useful way to look at anything. Anyway, let's move on. So that's just a model to think about. How do we encourage and focus on reflection following activities which follow a training course? And of course, so we're coming to this idea of deliver activities, not just lots more content. There's some people I say, we do learning transfer and we've got this portal, these extra e-learning and all of this. And I'm thinking it's just a whole lot more content. There's nothing wrong with that, but actually it probably won't work very much because people probably won't visit it that much. So what you got to do is start thinking about delivering activities to people. And there's some interesting research done by BJ Fogg at Stanford University, which I've lent on, and this is in my book on learning transfer too. And it's the Fogg behavior model. So it's Fogg with 2 G's. And he's got, by the way, his website's wonderful. There's all sorts of great stuff on there. It's well worth a good look around. So he came up with this formula amongst all of the other behavioral science stuff he does, is behavior happens or at the same, when there's motivation in place, when there's the ability to do it, and there's a prompt in place. And that's this formula of B equals MAP. So a behavior will occur when these other 3 things are present at the same time, at least at a threshold level. So if we put on this graph, ability down the bottom. So the first thing, if I was to ask you to do something for me, if I was to give you a prompt, a call to action, I don't know, could you please fetch me a glass of water? The first thing that will go through your mind is, how difficult is that to do? Will it frustrate me? Will it annoy me? Can I do it? Is it easy to do? Is it hard to do? So that bottom thing is my impression of how difficult something is to do when I'm asked to do it. Is it easy or is it hard? And up the side, we've got how motivated I am in the moment to do that thing, now that I have a judgment of how difficult it is to do. So fairly obviously, if you've got prompts that are easy to do and I'm highly motivated to do them, the behavior will occur. It will certainly, the prompt will succeed, the behavior will start. Also, clearly, if you've got a prompt where it looks like it's something that's hard to do, or will take me a long time and be frustrating or difficult, and actually my motivation right now is not that high anyway, chances are the prompt will fail. So you've got what he calls an action line. So any prompts to the right of that line will succeed, prompts below it will fail. Now, what I find really interesting is very often when people are doing some follow-up from a training course, they deliver people prompts that are all below the action line. And then they wonder why they don't work. Well, this is why. And the typical scenario for this, by the way, is, at the end of a training day, you might say, well, can you write down 3 goals you're going to achieve as a result of this training? And usually those are quite big goals. So when I come to look at them after the training, I'm thinking, oh my God, I don't want to start that today. That's too big. I won't do that. So what you end up with is the idea that you really need to be delivering lots of little activities often over a period of time that cumulatively build up to the bigger things that you're wanting them to do. So in terms of follow-up to a training course for learning transfer, the little and often mantra, you need to be keeping to that. How do we deliver them lots of little activities over a period of time? And each of those activities is small enough they can say, oh, I can do that. I'll do that. And the way you deliver that prompt can also make a big difference. So the wording around the prompt, the time it's delivered, the time of day, all of those sorts of things have an impact on the level of motivation that might be there in the moment when the prompt is delivered. So there's a whole science around that. And again, we don't have time right now to get into it. There's more in my book on that. So that's just Fogg's behavioral model. So again, this is this concept of, at a strategic level, if we're saying we must do learning transfer, that means we've got to be thinking about a program spread over time. And that means we've got to do, well, what are we going to do over that period of time? What we're doing is delivering lots of little activities that cumulatively over time will get people to practice, experiment, and so on, until the way they are doing things is just the new way, until that behavior, that new behavior becomes embedded and then sustained over the long term. And then it's just the way people do things around there. So effectively, you're talking about culture change. So if we're thinking about culture, let's look at this one. So this was that number 12 on those 12 levers model, is the transfer expectations depend on the culture. So I remember being in a training room center once with the head of training, and we were sitting there having a coffee and talking about stuff, and we watched a lot of delegates come out of the training rooms to go off for their morning tea break. It's England, it was tea. And I said, if I was to go and ask a lot of those people, what would happen if you as a delegate did nothing with what you just learned in the classroom? What would happen? And the head of L&D had the good grace to look quite sheepish and say, well, actually nothing. There are no consequences. So basically they had a culture where someone coming back from a training course, there were no expectations set on them at all. So that's the other thing to think about strategically, is at a cultural level, what do we need in place in order to support and manage the support that they need to do all the activities and so on. And this comes back to peer support, to manager support, to environmental support, the opportunity to experiment and practice and so on. So just think about, for the moment, following this webinar, what are the transfer expectations that you have of yourself? Are you going to do anything with it? I hope so. If not, why are you here? Do you have any colleagues that you're aware, who are aware you're on this webinar? Will you talk to them about it? If so, what are their expectations of what you're going to do? Will anybody even notice if you do something or not about this webinar? Or indeed any formal training that you take an hour out to do, or even a day out to do? That's some really good questions. So how are you going to hold yourself accountable for doing something different? It's really interesting. There's a lot of companies I work with around learning transfer, and I will do masterclasses and all sorts on it. And I say to them beforehand, you know what's going to be your biggest problem? I'm going to teach you about learning transfer. I'll show you what to do. It's actually not that difficult. But your biggest problem is going to be learning transfer, is actually going away and doing it. Yeah? Now, so that's kind of what we've been covering, is how do you get that embedded into your learning and development strategy in a way that it becomes an imperative that we look at every course and consider all of the learning transfer aspects around that course and all of those 12 levers. And then how do we, at a tactical level, start implementing and making them happen? So what are the other question on that page in front of us now, what are the forces driving your transfer? So those, that's kind of me done. We got some time for questions now, but if you want to go onto my website, you can see a bit more about some of the stuff that I do. And there's some free downloads on there, some tips booklets, some other guides and all sorts like that. So there's the 3 books and the 3 elephants. But do link up on LinkedIn. I'd be delighted to link with you and have any conversations you want to have. But hopefully we've got a few questions. I've not been monitoring the chat. So where are we at with questions?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. That was really, really interesting. We do have some questions, so I'll dive straight in. The first one is actually from Jill Gary, and it's about the learning stack. So do you consider reflection in the same box as teachbacks?
Oh, if I knew what a teachback was, I would...
I think that's when you go back into the organisation, and please drop in the chat, Jill, if I get this wrong, but I think it's when you go back into an organisation and actually teach back what they just learned. Yeah, so Jill's just typed in, asking someone to teach me what they just learned. So do you consider reflection to be in the same box as teachback?
Yes, it is. It's at level 5 in that stack, which is the preparing a lesson plan to teach. And it's the preparation of that lesson plan. So what you don't want to do is put them on the spot and force them to do it there and then without some reflection. So say, please go away and think for 10 minutes or quarter of an hour or until tomorrow, and then teach back, to give them time to reflect. And the reason that's really powerful is, in order to do that, you've got to think a bit more about how someone who is new to that subject would approach it, or what their thinking is around it. So you have to think like a newbie all over again, in effect. And that makes you think about the subject in a different way. And that's why teaching is such a powerful thing. But it's not the actual act of teaching, it's the act of preparing what you're going to teach that actually gives you that insight and that different way of thinking about it.
Yeah, that's great. And I guess that also links back to what you were talking about in terms of that transfer expectations. Another question we've had is about, do you have a good example of when, you can build that accountability for those transfer expectations?
Yes. I mean, aside from what we're doing here, I also have a software company, and we've got some software that can manage that accountability stack, if you like. If you are going to deliver them lots of little activities, you pretty much got to go digital to do that in order to manage that process effectively. Difficult to do that at scale with spreadsheets and Outlook. But you do have to hold people accountable. And it's not just hold the delegate accountable, there's also usually a need to hold their manager accountable for supporting them effectively. And then you usually have to have another layer again to hold the manager, the line manager, accountable for doing their job to support the delegate. So you need that kind of multi-layer accountability stack in place in order to really make these things work. I mean, once people are used to that, they will then get on with it and do it. But in the early days, you definitely have to hold people accountable. And you've got to do it in a way that they realize there are consequences. Because if there are no consequences, they'll just ignore it because that's easier to do than do. And just doing what we've always done is easier than doing something different. So because it does involve change. And so you do typically have to have consequences around that. And I'm not saying big stick to beat them up with or anything, but you've also got to lead them as well as drive them. So there needs to be, say, this is useful because there's some benefits to everybody around this. So there's all of that mindset stuff as well. So I'm not saying run around with a big stick and beat people up if they're not doing something. That's not the right answer either. But it's a mixture of all sorts of
behavior. No, and you'd rather sort of get that culture of encouraging that sharing. Absolutely, yes.
And also you need a system in place, and I mean the Fuse system's great with the data as well, is just saying, where can we find the people that are not doing stuff? Because they're the weak links in our chain. We need to find them and either help them and convert them to the new way of doing things, or, to be honest, shift them to somewhere where they can do less damage, because otherwise they're going to be limiters on the ability to progress and change culture.
Yeah, and with that, is there an element of, speed with this? So, being able to go back and teach back what you've learned quickly, is there sort of some relevancy about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're fighting the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve fairly obviously with this, well, like anything where you present material to people. But the thing is, that's less of a problem if you've got the relevance thing sorted out, because when stuff's relevant, people will go back and start doing it, using it pretty much immediately because it's relevant. Because it's something, well, this works for me right now, and then they'll also automatically probably start teaching colleagues because they feel it's the best thing to do. Hey, this is really helping me. Yeah, you should do this as well. Why stop doing that old stuff? Hey, this is really neat. I just learned about this. It's cool. You should be doing it too. So that kind of teach back will almost start happening automatically if you get the relevance right and the content right.
Yes, absolutely. And also what you mentioned about the external factors. So those processes and systems in place as well to allow that to happen.
Yeah. So that's the other thing is what are and that's why I went through that first diagram, that sort of environment and user, what's stopping them doing. So when someone goes back into their workplace, what are the barriers to them implementing the new skills and knowledge they've got? And very often the barriers are too high. And they'll go back. And I mean, I've even heard of circumstances where a delegate will go back and the manager says, oh God, that course here, I did that years ago, it was a waste of time. Forget about that. Let's get on with what we normally do. And that's it, it's all over. So that's the worst case. The best case, of course, is manager says, oh, what did you learn? How can I help? Let's get that going. You teach me too, please. It's years since I've been on that course. So you get that whole spectrum of line manager, support or not. But ideally what you want is to try and get that more consistent. And one way to do that, of course, is some kind of digital platform.
Yeah, no, that's really great insight. We have another question here from Catherine Toll, and it's, would you have a different strategy for mature learners versus newer learners?
Yes. The mature learners usually are going to be more senior, so you'll find the way that they want to learn can be different. I've found that they don't really want to go to a classroom often. They'd rather have coaching and do things a bit differently. And also the way their day planners or diaries are set up is different. So they, might get pulled and pushed a lot more, so aren't as readily available for formal courses and things, just because of the way their schedules work. So there's all of that stuff. But what I'm not saying is that generational learning, it's got to work for the people that are there and what's going to suit them. Someone new into post is going to need a lot more content to come up to speed typically, but what you do have to be very careful of is you don't overwhelm them with content too quickly, because otherwise they will just forget most of it before they get to use it. So again, you've got to start thinking about a program spread over time rather than an event. So it's also saying, well, for that segment, that cohort, whatever, and for that program, what would be the most beneficial way to spread this stuff over that period of time? What do they need to know now and then tomorrow and the next day and so on? And that probably will vary a bit depending on their seniority.
Great. No, thank you for that. And I think that's also interesting in terms of the different ways you can have learning now, you know, be it face-to-face or digital or a blended approach. And I think all of those will have a different method.
Some of it's you've got to come back to that just in case or just in time thinking, saying, well, what do we really need to be doing here? And a lot of adults don't do well with just in case learning because it doesn't have that much relevance for them. You might need that one day, so we'll teach it to you. And they're saying, well, what if I never need it?
That's related to what you said.
And Google has taught us that, you know, so much stuff is available on demand. So it's kind of, well, when I need it, I'll find it out. So then you've got to start looking at, well, how do we teach them to find it out easily? How do we teach them to use support systems? And how do we teach them to learn and then unlearn and relearn when they need to? So those are the skills that are becoming almost more important now than actually the knowledge retention itself in a lot of roles.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I have another question here, a really good one from Jack Lockhart. What do you see as the 3 biggest challenges with implementing this different approach and mindset as someone part of a larger team?
Okay. Hi, Jack. Good to hear from you. Jack, by the way, did some lovely reviews of my 3 books. So the biggest challenge usually is going to be your senior team. Sorry, because they don't know enough about L&D. So chances are you're going to have to do a sales job on the senior team to convince them that the money that you might have to spend on learning transfer is worth spending, because they still have the idea that pixie dust exists, partly because learning and development has convinced them it exists over decades. And they still kind of have that traditional view of learning and training in an organization. So that's usually the biggest hurdle, is the senior team, and convincing them that you need to be doing things a little differently. And that's not so easy sometimes. There's a whole bunch of stuff in the front of my green book on learning transfer, on some models and ideas you can take to them to help have that conversation. And that's one of the reasons I wrote the book, is to help have that conversation in an effective way with the senior team. And it's easy to do. I mean, but very often nobody takes the time to do it. So you need to convince them and talk with them too about where they learned everything. And they'll say, well, I learned it, you know, when I was on the job, when I was doing things, that's where I learned it. Well, that's where we've got to teach people. That's where we've got to work with them, is in the workflow. So that's all part of that conversation. So much of that is about teaching them about informal learning, which is where the 70-20-10 model is really useful, because they can relate to that. And that, to me, is the primary use of the 70-20-10 model, is a way of convincing the senior team that informal learning is important. And informal learning is a key component of learning transfer, because it's what people learn after the training course when they really put it into action. So that would be, I would say, yeah, the view or the attitude of the senior team is going to be the biggest challenge. But if you think about it from a budget perspective, you're seeking budget. If you put, let's be generous. I mean, Brinkerhoff said 1 in 6 people. Let's be generous and say 1 in 5 people that you put in a traditional training course will pick up what you give them and run with it. And that's been confirmed so many times. It's there or thereabouts. 20% of the people pick it up and run with it. These are the people with a fairly high growth mindset, if you know Carol Dweck's work. And then there's a couple of those 5 will play with it a bit. They might change a little bit, but you really wouldn't consider them a resounding success. And another couple won't do anything at all. They'll just do nothing. So if you've spent, I don't know, £100, $100 per head, you've spent 500 putting those 5 people in the classroom, and only one of them is going to be considered a success. So you've spent 500 on one person to be a success. But if you think about it, you could add a bunch of learning transfer stuff to that program, and it might cost you another 100, 200, but you'll pick up more than another 2 or 3 people, and you can call them successes. So actually the ROI on money spent on learning transfer is really obvious and straightforward. But the problem is that people in senior teams still have the myth in their mind that 100% of people coming out of a training course will be fully operational. And so you have to help them understand that that's not the case.
Thank you for that, Paul. I suppose a small question from me is actually, you know, the Brinkhoff research, is it different for digital training? Is it?
I can't really speak to that. The Brinkhoff stuff was done a long time ago and focused on face-to-face training, so in a pretty traditional sense. There is research I've seen that compares e-learning and face-to-face, and sometimes the face-to-face comes out a bit better, sometimes it's the other way around, and of course everybody leaps on one or the other depending on their own, whatever serves themselves the best. And I think that depends on the topic, the situation, and the prevailing culture, and also whether people are allowed to do something with it afterwards. So there's all of those different factors. Again, it's about going back to learning consultancy. Once you've proven through performance consulting that learning is required, then it's about saying, given that, what's the best route for this particular cohort, for this subject, in this environment, in this culture. So it's all quite variable.
Great. We have another question here, and it'll be the final question before we close. So it's, isn't it best to use Kirkpatrick's ROE, return on expectations, instead of ROI?
Yeah, I like the return on expectations idea, particularly because I'm not a huge fan of detailed ROI, crunch the numbers type stuff, because by the time you get through all of that, and I know people would probably differ with me on this, that there are enough margins of error in all the different inputs that the outputs aren't necessarily that robust. And also it's time consuming. So my thinking on this is that when you are, I quite like Brinkhoff's success case method, quite frankly, because that's actually looking at what worked really well and what didn't work so well, and let's fix our program to skew it more towards the, you know, the stuff that works really well. So that's much better as a fast, non-numerical way almost of improving what you're doing. And then you should be using business measures, and this is where the expectation, what are our expectations of business measure improvement given what we're doing? And that's, to me, that's a much better way to look at measurement. There's a whole lot of stuff in measurement, there's a whole chapter on it in the back of that green book. But I'm personally not a great fan of the ROI stuff when it is premised on the fact that we here as L&D are trying to prove our worth to the business. And I think that's kind of a mindset thing, is a lot of people say we have to have ROI because we have to prove our value to the business. And I'm thinking, well, hang on, that's kind of like setting yourself separate and saying, I'm here, please pay my salary. What you should be doing is saying, how can we keep improving what we're doing for the business? And if we keep doing that well, the business will be happy to keep paying us. It's just a slightly different mindset. But what it does do is it changes the way you harvest the data, the way you present it, the way you put dashboards up and all of that. And you tend to start focusing more on business improvement than just focusing on here's some numbers that we crunch that prove that we're a valid, you know, input to the business. It's a subtle difference, but I think it's really important. So that's just a little bit on that ROI stuff.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Paul, for today's webinar. It's been really fascinating. And for everyone who attended, thank you very much for taking the time. Our next webinar is Developing a Continuous Learning Culture with Nigel Payne, the leading learning consultant and author. And the link to register is in the chat. So please register and join us for our next webinar. So thank you so much, Paul, for everything. And thank you to everyone attending.
Thank you. And I highly recommend Nigel, by the way. Great guy, really knows his stuff.